But if the public does not tell the government what to do, if the public does not follow the issues and understand how they're being ripped off, then they're not players in a democracy. They're allowing themselves to be ripped off, and they're going to be harmed and are being harmed, both environmentally and financially, because of the high level of apathy.
America is at a turning point in its approach to hazardous waste. The U.S. presently produces 250 million tons of hazardous waste annually. 1 ton for every man, woman, and child. And production is increasing. By reducing the quantities of hazardous materials in use, our nation could both minimize the volumes of hazardous waste generated and decrease human and environmental exposure to toxic substances. For too long, we have focused our attention at the end of the pipe and worried about toxic materials after they were released into the environment. It's time to go to the front end of the pipe and prevent pollution at its source.
I was one of the people who started the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and started the Solid and Hazardous Waste Management Program. I helped write most of the laws involved with solid and hazardous waste in the United States. Back in the 70s, I was EPA's chief investigator doing cases like Love Canal, Woburn, Massachusetts, most of the contamination cases you've read about. Basically, hazardous waste is that fraction of the commercial and industrial waste stream that, if not handled properly, can cause major health and environmental problems to the public: cancer, birth defects, other health problems.
Ruth Knapp encountered an illegal toxic waste dump while hiking in the Capitol Forest near Olympia, Washington.
And she says, "Mom, don't go out there. It feels funny." And I recognized from what she said, it felt almost like quicksand. It didn't feel like normal sawdust that does have sponge and give, but it felt much more so. It was weird because suddenly we found ourselves down in this gully in a heavily wooded area up against an old barbed wire fence that was partially up. And I looked at my watch, and it was approximately about 35 minutes from the last time I had looked at it, realized that, but I didn't have any memory of where we had been in between. We were just elated to be safe, but that night, neither one of us could hardly sleep. And my daughter finally told me that when she closed her eyes, behind her eyelids, as she closed her eyes, she could see large white shapes, egg-shaped globules kind of thing, about the size of a small chicken egg that you would buy in a grocery store. And I was seeing the same thing. She was in high school in track and cross country, and at that time I did quite a bit of running, and so we monitored our heart rates and knew that our heart rate was way too high. We were exhausted and just wiped out for 3 to 4 days after that.
These problems occur when the waste material breaks out into the environment, whether into the air, where you will have inhalation problems, or depending on the material, if it's heavy metals, air pollution from hazardous waste, so those heavy metals can contaminate the soil. If the materials get into the water, can affect drinking water supplies, adversely affect surface water for fish and other forms of wildlife. If the materials through spill or other means gets onto the surface, it can contaminate the soil, and that contamination of soil can harm, obviously, agricultural uses of the land as well as areas where children play. So hazardous waste, if not handled properly, can affect the air, the land, and the water, and most of the resources that we enjoy here in America.
Cascade Pull operated at the tip of Butt Inlet since 1957 until 1986, when the Port of Olympia decided to discontinue the lease on the company. For at least 10 years before 1986, the Department of Ecology knew that there were some problems operational problems at the site. The majority of wood preserving companies have practices that generally are detrimental to the environment, and they mostly have to do with fairly often releases of pentachlorophenol and creosote to the environment. The biggest concern that ecology has at the site is the seeps that are seen on the East Bay at low tide. There's large quantities of contamination there. The seeps have been analyzed, and we have found that not only is there heavy molecular PAHs and pentachlorophenol, but we have also found several types of dioxin, although we have not found the most detrimental or the most carcinogenic one of them, which is the TCDD. Outside of that, the contamination just from the soils dispersing in the area is a concern, and the levels of the contamination are also a concern because they are so high. We are talking about 40 parts per million of highly carcinogenic materials. We have a direct effect to the marine life there. You just basically you have a no-growth area right in front of the site, and then you see some limited growth of different mollusks on the perimeters of that area. Also recently, in fact in November of '88, we did some limited core sampling and a joint effort with the Corps engineers, and we have found that indeed we do have contamination all the way out to at least 500 feet offshore and as far down as 15 feet vertically. So the additional concern of that is that perhaps the contamination is farther than we thought it was, and although it is at lower amounts than what you see in the direct perimeter of the site, you're still having quite an effect on the range of exposure to marine animals in the sediments.
The more we consume, the more we have to throw away. Rubbish or garbage, it all has to be pushed out of sight.
75% of commercial land disposal facilities in the U.S. are leaking and threaten to contaminate ground or surface waters. 1/3 of America's groundwater aquifers are contaminated.
This originally started to be a wood waste landfill, and it ended up being something other than that, industrial waste.
Oscar and Jackie Johnson can't drink their water. It often smells like chemicals and makes them sick. The creek that flows through their backyard used to be one of the most productive salmon streams in western Washington. That was before the Cisco landfill moved in next door.
We only have so much water on this earth. And what these people fail to realize is once it's gone, it's gone.
There is no technology to clean up groundwater aquifers. It's technically impossible to do. Once you've contaminated a groundwater aquifer, you've just written off that aquifer, and you have to look for other sources of water. Now, there are consulting engineers that'll tell you if you pay them $100 million, they'll play with it and try to do something. But there is no technology to clean up aquifers.
Two of the contractors for Environmental Protection Agency come up to the fill and come up in the government car and dressed in their white suits and looked around and said, well, sometimes these things are best left undisturbed. And they tried their camera, it didn't work, and went down by where we pointed out there were large amounts of cadmium deposits, and they would not take tests there. They took them off to the side. And out of their 15 to 20 minute site premise visit came a stack of paperwork about like that. And I was told later by Mr. Glasser, who is the EPA chief in Seattle that this cost the government $15,000. And it just appears to me that, everyone does their paperwork, but nobody does their work.
The regulatory agencies that are looking at the same data, and they are the Health Department, Department of Ecology, and EPA, are basically saying that there appears to be no imminent threat or danger, even though the data indicates that there's materials in the groundwater that aren't part of the natural background makeup of the groundwater chemistry. And what they're telling these people is they may have a problem, although they don't really think so, and that the contamination levels aren't significantly high enough to set off an agency corrective response. In effect, they're saying, maybe you got a problem, but it's not a big enough problem. And this is kind of where I start to tend to feel that there's a lot more political analyses going on than analytical analyses. And it's sort of a shuffle of the problem from agency to agency until someone adequately shelves it or buries it in the bureaucracy.
Boeing's sent their people out, and they toured the area, and they said yes, they had done it, but the agencies hadn't cited them for anything, so they didn't feel that at this point in time they felt responsible. And my thinking was that if you run through a stop sign, if you don't get a ticket, you're not going to run down to the police station and say, hey, I run through a stop sign, I want to pay it.
What's happened in the last 8 to 10 years is that the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, as well as state agencies, have never fined companies who cause major pollution problems the full extent of money required to remedy the problem. On top of that, we at Washington EPA and the state EPAs and in our regional offices have never fined companies that have broken the law more than the money they've saved and earned by breaking the law, so that for all intents and purposes, if a company saves, say, $30 million by breaking the law and polluting the environment, the most they can expect to get fined is maybe $3 million. So as the programs are being carried out today, there's a positive incentive for companies to break the law with regards to hazardous waste management.
This is Northwest Petrochemical. The company's been here for about 28 years. They make, they actually take the waste from the refineries, the caustics they're called, and they continue to refine them to crucilic acids as well as phenols and sodium sulfate. The phenols are used in such compounds as pine sol and other resins that they make. Some of the stuff is very, very nasty stuff. The phenols, some of their disposal practices of these phenols was to just let them run into this ditch here, which is an open ditch across underneath the road into Padilla Bay, which at one point did have an oyster and clam population in it on these beaches down here, none of which there are none now. There are no shellfish at all now. In 1971, they were tested by some Department of Ecology people, and the shellfish had extremely high levels of phenols in their tissues. Phenols are extremely caustic chemicals. There were 5 injection wells here. They were only permitted for 3, so 2 were illegally drilled. And when they went to close the wells, they found that the casings were broken all along the whole 136 feet, 360 feet. So that means that the waste, the dangerous waste, were seeping out at all different levels. The nearest well is here just across the yard. And it was only when our group formed that they were some of our first members, and we became advocates for them. They endured a tremendous amount of odor and noise. We don't know what damage has been done to their health, actually, over breathing the compounds for years. No one knows what the compounds are, as a matter of fact. No air toxic studies were done until just recently, and those results aren't in yet. But the Moans had took such pride in their property and always mowed the lawn and planted flowers, and they always had trouble with the trees and the plants on the back part of the property. It always looked like they were diseased and like somebody had taken a blowtorch to them. And now there's another company, General Chemical, which is up on the hill here. They make sulfuric acid. And they just recently, a neighbor close to here was walking along the road, and the county road crew was out cleaning out the ditches down from Allied Chemical and uncovered a drainage pipe. And they have checked around now and had the Department of Ecology people out here, and they're draining sodium sulfate directly out into Padilla Bay. They do not have a permit for that, and we don't know how long the practice has been going on, but needless to say, it's going to stop now. But one wonders what else is going on around here when we're just actually casually investigating. We're just a citizens group. We can only do so much, but what we've managed to uncover just on our own is, I think it's the tip of the iceberg.
When you begin to control wastewater discharges, stuff may end up going up the stack. When you try to control what's going up the stack, it ends up going into the hazardous waste stream. And I think that gets to the basic point that we really need to be taking an approach that's going to focus on reducing the use of toxic and hazardous materials in the first place, so that you're not just constantly displacing a problem from one medium to another.
Basically, over 99% of the hazardous waste generated in the United States comes from the major Fortune 500 companies from all over the country, and they're the byproducts of the manufacturing of products that are sold in commerce. Hazardous waste or waste materials from the manufacturing process really are or demonstrate inefficiency in manufacturing. Raw materials go into a plant and products are made from it. Where there's waste, just like everything else, that means that all of the raw materials haven't been fully utilized properly. So companies can make a capital investment and change the processes that they use to minimize waste, and that will protect the environment, and it will also make their manufacturing operations more efficient, but it does require capital investment.
Product reformulation, manufacturing process modification, equipment redesign, recovery of waste materials for reuse. The ideas are as diverse as the many products 3M manufactures. To make flexible electronic circuits, long webs of copper must be cleaned, coated with a photosensitive material, and etched with circuit patterns. Before 3P, the copper was cleaned with a chemical spray, creating hazardous waste which required special disposal. Now, the chemical spray has been replaced with rotating brushes which scrub the copper with pumice. The fine abrasive pumice leaves a non-hazardous sludge which can be disposed of easily. In its first year, this simple change resulted in a savings of $15,000 and prevented 20 tons of hazardous liquid waste. Savings increase each year as production increases. Further along in the circuit production process, solvents used for developing and etching the copper are now collected, distilled, and reused. Even solvents washing into the copper's rinse water are reclaimed before the water goes down the drain. After 10 years, 3P now prevents every year more than 98,000 tons of air pollutants, 10,500 tons of water pollutants, 151,000 tons of solid waste, more than 1 billion gallons of wastewater, and saves the energy equivalent of 210,000 barrels of oil. And we're just getting started.
Many companies have made those capital investments, and many other companies choose not to make those capital investments, but feel in the short run that it's cheaper just to generate a lot of waste rather than changing the plant or process.
The Hylobos waterway of Commencement Bay in southern Puget Sound is a toxic hotspot and federal Superfund site. Spills, discharges, disposal practices, and surface runoff have concentrated industrial wastes in sediments, where they cause damage to marine organisms and concentrate in the food chain.
Superfund was a law that I helped create back in the 70s that would provide a pot of money for EPA to do remedial action and help people who are being poisoned or risk of being poisoned from hazardous waste management.
And it was a very large marine estuary, very biologically diverse and very abundant, and a lot of the critters still show up, like geese trying to nest there. Estimates from the Environmental Protection Agency are that it's going to cost approximately $35 million to clean up the contaminated sediments in the bay, and that doesn't include our team's work, which is to stop the upland sources of ongoing chemical contamination.
It was never designed to clean up to pristine all toxic emergencies in the country. There isn't enough money in the United States or in the world to pay to bring America back to where it was 100 years ago in terms of cleanliness. But it did afford us a pot of money that we could use to at least minimize risk to people who live in contaminated areas. And Superfund further allowed us the opportunity to sue the polluters, the people who caused the problems, for up to 3 times the cost that would be expended for cleaning up the mess, thus giving them an incentive not to continue to create these kinds of messes.
Penwalt Corporation discharged arsenic, chlorinated hydrocarbons, and polyaromatic hydrocarbons through groundwater seeps and their main wastewater outfall. Occidental Chemical Corporation was permitted to discharge chlorinated organic compounds through their main wastewater outfall. Slag, a waste product from copper smelting, was used historically as fill and ballast for log sorting yards, providing a hard surface for operating heavy equipment. But tannic acid from wood stripped arsenic from the slag, allowing the arsenic to percolate into groundwater and enter the waterway through seeps. General Metals of Tacoma salvages appliances and other scrap metal for shipment to the Orient. These materials are piled to the water's edge and are uncontained during heavy rains. General Metals is suspected of contributing PCBs to the waterway.
Well, PCBs concentrate in the fat or lipid tissues of organisms, and in marine mammals, the seals and killer whales that we've looked at, we found very high concentrations in the blubber of these animals. Such high concentrations that the practice of rendering the blubber for seal oil and for human consumption, as was done by Native Americans historically, it would be very toxic and dangerous for them to eat seal oil from harbor seals in southern Puget Sound at this point in time.
The toxics that are entering our urban bays are not only affecting just the sediments right there and the critters that live there and pass through, but it's also spreading around to other parts of the sound, is being uptaken by fish and crabs, and some of those are being eaten by humans.
Unfortunately, Superfund is not operating as properly. We're not going against the responsible parties, the polluters, and charging them 3 times the cost. We're just using taxpayer money to, quote, try to clean up sites at great expense, and we're ending up creating new sites because most of the Superfund sites are being dug up, creating a pollution problem when we dig, and then being taken to another area that's pristine, and we're contaminating that area. One of the problems that Washington State is going to face if they go ahead with these 2 major hazardous waste projects in the east is a large amount of material that they'll be dumping in agricultural area will be contaminated material from not only the western part of Washington, but from the whole country.
Rural areas across the United States are being targeted for waste colonies by national conglomerates. There are plans to site half a dozen facilities, including 2 giant hazardous waste facilities in eastern Washington, primarily downwind from the Hanford Nuclear Reservation, an area with pre-existing environmental health problems spawned by radioactive emissions.
There has been constant denial. There has been denial that there would even be a health problem that would exist. I just recently read a study that was a county study of all the states in the United States, and where there, this is not necessarily the nuclear issue, but where there was a super fund site, each county had a higher than normal or higher than expected rate of several different kinds of cancers. And I think that's the same type thing we see here in this area, that the Garfield County, Columbia County, and Asotin County, for a 20-year time period, were in the 99 percentile of cancer, 15 different types of cancers for that time period. And still our State Department denied that there was a problem. It's just abhorrent to me to even think that they would consider bringing another polluting type, emission type plant into the area until this other issue has been resolved.
There's a number of reasons that come into play why we're being invaded by these different facilities that are trying to dump waste in our area. Most of them fall under what was known as the, or is known as the Sorrell Report. We, first of all, are less politically strong than other areas. When you take a look at the population base, there's not too many people that live out here to object to it. The people that live here are on the ordinary conservative individuals, farmers and ranchers. They say that we fall under categories which are designated as nature exploitative, such as farming, ranching, logging, and so on. They have some other categories that we fall under also, and relatively speaking, a number of people that live here are rather naive as to the real intent of these companies as to what they would like to do.
They refer to themselves as saying that this National Hazardous Waste Network.
Full service.
Full service National Hazardous Waste Network. The jewel they need, all right, to top this off is the site to dump it at. They've got the railroad tracks that touch 35 states. All right, they've got John Mathis and Associates now
To find their
to find it for
dump,
them.
right.
You know, they need a place to dump it. And that's what this dump's going to be for them.
And they talk about needing, what, 40 acres for their footprint, but they bought something like 30,000. They could dump a lot of waste for a long time.
The top 30 chemical companies in the U.S. had a 52% increase in their after-tax earnings in 1987. In 1988, their after-tax profits rose by 67%. The U.S. chemical industry's total sales soared to more than $240 billion in 1988. At the same time, the industry spent less than 0.5% of their sales on pollution control equipment. According to EPA's data, U.S. industries are generating hazardous waste at the rate of 1 million pounds a minute. A mid-sized chemical plant like this BASF facility, located in Louisiana's Cancer Alley, produces 30,000 pounds of hazardous waste an hour, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year.
Corporate society is designed for one thing, and that's to make a profit, make money for the people that own the corporation. We have this fiction of a corporation, legal fiction of a corporation being a person, and that's so you can avoid liability of the individual. Now, to make a profit in the waste management business, what they have to do is have a lot of waste. So they really don't object to the creation of waste by any matter of means. It means more waste than more profit, and that's what the goal of a corporation is, more and more profit. No other goal at all. They're not set to serve society, they are set to serve the people that own the corporation, which are really a handful of people on Wall Street.
The image has become a toxic form of communication in the service of manufacturing corporate identities and seeding disinformation.
A company called Ecos is tackling the issue head-on.
the most wonderful video. It has all these beautiful scenes of waterfalls and forests, rolling wheat fields, combines, horses running through open fields. Played on all your values, all the things you enjoy, and then it showed you some household hazardous waste and told you that they were the solution, and if you doubt them, you know, that you basically were not credible.
Until now, disposal of our hazardous waste has been someone else's problem. But that's about to change.
If these plans come to fruition, the two facilities that are being proposed in the eastern part of the state, in both Grant and Adams County together, would be one of the largest hazardous waste management operations in the world. And obviously the majority of hazardous waste that would be going to those facilities would be coming from other states as well as other countries.
Some of the stuff just falls right into the water. You can go back down farther and it's just pushed off the bank into the water. And
Well, you don't need this kind of facility. In other words, the state of Washington can require their generators to handle the majority of their hazardous waste themselves on site and can continue to send what residuals are left to commercial facilities outside of the state. So you don't need it. The law doesn't require you to have it either. But if you do go into that business, there will be a lot of money to be made by companies like Burlington Northern. Some of the people in the garbage disposal business are trying to get into it. So there are a lot of profits available.
They tell them, you're a farmer, you use farm chemicals, all right? You use hazardous waste. Your wife, she cleans her oven with oven cleaner. All right? In fact, the literature they give out, what is hazardous waste? They give this long list. Like this was a list of waste they'd be accepting at their site. Started off, number 1, oven cleaner, you know, 2, agricultural cans. It goes down to this whole list. Down at the bottom, the last item of this was least important, all right, was industrial waste and sludges. All right. It's really, they're playing on these people's values, their sense of responsibility, all right, to make them feel responsible. They're making the victims, the potential victims of this site, feel responsible, and it's their duty to take this site.
Well, I've been on this farm all my life. I'm 71 years old today.
Temperature. That's the wind. It's the ground temperature.
Ecos is trying to build an incinerator near Lind, Washington, which is about 40 miles directly west of us. Now, this is right in the heart of agriculture of Adams County. And we're quite concerned about the emissions. That is, we know that the possible permitted emissions by the EPA regulations can put out an amount of material that is completely unacceptable to the agricultural area, both wheat and livestock. And this can cut into our production a great deal. And after some 75 years of building this farm, we don't want to see this stuff start.
From the top of this hill, we're able to see Washington, Oregon, and Idaho very clearly at most any time that we wish. This particular area of eastern Washington has some of the cleanest air that there is left in the United States. This is just one of the many reasons that we should not site any of these types of facilities here. It's just too much of a pristine area to destroy.
Some of your industries, like Boeing, will be given an opportunity to transfer the liabilities of their waste from the western part of the state to the eastern part of the state, the large agricultural area. Now, on the downside, the farmers in the eastern part of the state will have a much more difficult time selling their products. So basically, you'll be throwing away the economic benefits of the eastern part of the state if you go into the large commercial hazardous waste business.
Potatoes are a big market in the world, and in the state of Washington, we produce half of the nation's French fries right here in the Columbia Basin, so it's no really small thing. By the same token, we have 5 states of wheat being commingled at the export terminals, and this is where the perception comes in. If someone out there in the Pacific Rim or elsewhere in the world perceives that our products are going to be contaminated in any way, shape, or form, they'll cut our markets off.
Now these potato sellers is about 5 miles downwind from the proposed site.
The ECOS hazardous waste facility will include an incinerator because many hazardous wastes can be destroyed by high temperature. The waste would be subjected to temperatures in excess of 2,200 degrees. The searing heat breaks down the waste. In addition, sophisticated pollution control equipment will clean the exhaust before it's vented. Incineration is a proven technology currently being used worldwide.
Well, incineration of hazardous waste, especially in the present regulatory climate, is very bad. For example, you can legally take heavy metals. Heavy metals are things like arsenic, cyanide, and put them into incinerators and burn them. Other commercial incinerators take it. The law presently allows you to burn those kinds of materials. Well, let's take arsenic. When you put arsenic into an incinerator, it goes right up the stack. Even if you have a scrubber on the stack, the arsenic will still go right into the air, and so you're basically putting poisons directly into the air.
Dioxins, for instance, come out as a byproduct or as a product in incomplete combustion in the chimneys of these incinerators. And dioxins readily are picked up by all kinds of plant life, and then the livestock eat them, and it goes on. It gets to the milk, to the meat, to all kinds of products that come off from agriculture.
The real appeal with incineration for most of these companies is the fact that it gets around the liability associated with the cradle-to-grave laws.
Half the cost and no empty containers of future liability. MSP.
And I think the people in Eastern Washington have every right to put their feet down firmly and say, we're not going to accept having something like this in our community when we don't even have the right regulations in place. Aside from all the health questions, we don't even have adequate regulations in place to give us any guarantee that this is going to be run safely.
We value the environment and protect it with some of the toughest safeguards in America. Still, for as far as we've come, much remains to be done. Case in point, hazardous waste. Not nuclear waste, hazardous waste.
So what I did is I called Hank McGuire, which is in charge of the Hanford Reservation. And I told him who I was. I explained that I'd worked out there for many years. I asked him then, I says, well, what do you plan on doing with your low-level radioactive waste, since there's 3 to 4 times more low-level radioactive waste out there than there is high-level radioactive waste? And he told me, he says, well, there's this new company called ECOS, and we're right now in negotiations with them for them to take all our low-level radioactive waste off-site to their incinerator. They're saying now it's miraculously safe. They're hypocritical. What they're doing is they're trying to find a place to dump this stuff at the very cheapest way they can possibly do it, and they don't care about the people.
The process of negotiation and citizen participation used by ECOS in siting their incinerator was thinly veiled social engineering with all the window dressings of democracy. We understand that you had said that you would leave, Lynn, if the voters said that they didn't want you, and we understand that there was an election in August that said that ECOS was not wanted here, and wondering why you have decided to stay.
I just started working here on Monday, and I would like to refer you to the girls that are running the office. Eileen DeArmond is the director of the site development, and Laura Williams is the manager of the community relations. And neither are here right now.
We were pointed out to Eileen DeArmond, who was the spokesperson for ECOS. We were pushed off to the side, and taken around separately from anybody else, and they didn't answer a single one of our questions. They, you know, we don't know this, we can't say that. When you asked them about other facilities in the country, they got very defensive, you know.
And they didn't know, gee, we don't know about any problems at any other facilities.
So there were two that blew up. And I would say there's not necessarily a great deal of confidence in the companies that are running these things.
A state biologist has made a rather curious finding. There are very few bugs around here. No chiggers, no mosquitoes, very few flies on the Hass farm, even around the dairy barn.
And about a month ago, after a rain shower, Hass says, thousands of worms crawled out of the ground and died. Residents say they suspect chemicals have poisoned everything around.
I've never seen nothing like that in my 49 years. They just died. They just died right there.
Burlington Environmental has been, in the last year, set up as a separate corporation. They have severed their ties, theoretically, with Burlington Northern. However, they still have a joint
interlocking board
of directors. What they really have done is they've fallen back and are trying to protect the assets of the major corporation. But for all intents and purposes, they are the same companies. And the reason I bring this up is I'd like to point out the fact that their environmental record, even though ECOS claims to be a new company, is in essence not what it appears to be. There are some 14 sites in the state of Montana that Burlington Northern has trashed, basically. They have one site in Livingston, Montana. They have over 1 million gallons of diesel fuel sitting on top of the aquifer and some unknown quantity of heavier than water solvents, basically chlorinated solvents, sitting on the bottom of the aquifer, and they're refusing to clean them up. They are literally refusing. They are being sued by the state of Montana to clean them up.
Corporate contamination is something that you see in two ways. It totally contaminates our political process. It totally contaminates people's control of their own lives and people's control of their government, because the corporations, having the immense wealth that they have the ability to control the regulators, the legislators, the courts, the president, the members of Congress. They control the people who we supposedly think are representing us. They don't represent us. They represent that power structure. And thus it is we, the people, that have to finally realize what the waste mongers are doing in terms of destroying us.
In order to get a site for their dump, ECOS has already begun poisoning the minds and the hearts and pitting people against each other. It's just an intrinsic part of their process.
You are no longer welcome in the Golden Grain Cafe, and if you do step in, we'll file trespassing charges against you. Well, I thought that was pretty good. I didn't do nothing. I just sat in there, had a meal, had some drinks, and that's what happened. We get kicked out.
Contrary questions and entertaining the notion that perhaps these facilities weren't such a good idea, then we became branded as, you know, kind of bad boys in the community.
It sure split them up. There's a few people that like it and think it's the only thing, but most of the thinking people don't really care for it.
They have tried to get one person that is very outspoken fired. They went up to the auditor's office and got information that really isn't public knowledge to try and discredit this person. They just try to humiliate you and make you look bad in the eyes of the community.
Well, those railroad companies have always been noted for being rather ruthless, and I don't think Burlington Northern's any exception, even today.
We were actually the kickoff for the state centennial.
We decided to have a big centennial celebration and construct some type of memorial to commemorate our 100 years. It attracted enough attention that a Seattle newspaper even came over and was so impressed with us that they wrote like a page-long article about our community and how much spirit we had and how we worked together and what a close-knit community we were. And that's just seemed to all gone by the wayside now.
They said, we will buy 640 acres. Well, farmers from miles around would line up. There'd be rows of caddies out in front of ECOS's office with farmers with their maps. They wanted to be the one to win the jackpot and to sell off enough of their property to be able to move away. Well, Ecos fooled them all. They bought it from Travelers Insurance.
The neat part was they've been negotiating for over a year and never telling these poor farmers who were, in the meantime, the farmers were pitched against each other. There were economic boycotts in the town. Some of the people in the adjoining communities who were being threatened by the town who was going to give their okay were boycotting the services of that town.
And Ecos and Lynn were both fighting over the toxic waste dump because which town was going to get the new park or the new swimming pool or the new community center. And so Ecos that has so much money to throw away can come into these communities and spend a pittance and find themselves somebody who will sell out.
On March 14th in 1989, Ecos, with a 2-day notice, well, they say their investigative committee called the vote, but Ecos uses those results all the time, held a vote. We were told that was just to see if we wanted to keep getting the education. And
everything they do is so strange. They put out the vote. They put out the ballot. Stamped to that ballot were 5 pages worth of bribes, including the salaries, the jobs at the sites, pools, these sort of things that they're going to do for your community.
Well, the more we talked, the more we listened, we found out that there's a lot of people really upset because they didn't understand the vote and they felt they were misled.
And you find that's all a lie. You're finding out now that, when they said they could pay for all the roads in and out of the facilities, they're now coming back with their lawyers and demanding the county pay for it.
And Ecos had said from the very beginning, and we've got it on tape and everything else, that they would not go where they are not wanted. Well, when the results showed up that they were no longer wanted, they then told us that, well, by the time the plant goes in, you will be educated enough that you will want this in here.
There's a guidebook how to do this, and what they're doing is precisely by this book.
They really are quite sensible, and when you give them the whole equation, lay it all out for them to see, and make their own judgments, they basically do the sensible thing.
The Washington Centennial Commission has selected what many consider to be the most spectacular overlook in the state for Grandfather Cuts Loose the Ponies, a sculpture commemorating Washington's centennial. The Rabanco Company has proposed the same area to place a towering incinerator stack spewing toxic emissions.
They are not at all like Ecos in their tactics. They have not used the Sorrell Report's approach, Their approach basically is to shove it down the people's throats. Anybody who opposes them gets sued, basically.
I'm very concerned about the effect any incinerator, hazardous waste incinerator, will have on the food supply out here. All of them have some emissions, and they emit some of the most toxic materials known. In this, I have worked through and talked to different Chamber of Commerce and so on. As a result of that, I've had letters from Rabanco's attorneys telling me to cease and desist because they don't like what I'm saying. But we just merely sticking to facts.
I've had quite a bit of pressure to not view my opinions publicly, and this pressure came about from a deposition that I had to give against a friend of mine, Jim Weitzel, and the company tried to say that there was collusion between us and against this company, and that simply wasn't a fact at all.
It was a case of refusing to commit perjury. The signature on the application required us to certify that everything in the permit application was true, complete, and accurate under penalty of perjury under the federal RCRA law.
He was doing everything he could to help the people in this county try and avert a catastrophe.
They did use one of the same tools. Basically, the site that was initially proposed out there was a storage facility for agricultural cans, a holding area before they moved them off to a hazardous waste site. Okay, it is on county land, leased by the county. County tried to back out of the lease, got sued.
And we said, hey, wait a minute. We did not okay a major hazardous waste facility for garbage and for hazardous materials from the Northwest. This was for an agricultural can dump.
It's located above the Columbia River. It's a disastrous location.
I think it's on an earthquake fault, is it not?
It's on an earthquake fault. It's on a ridge which is lower than the groundwater, a quarter mile away.
I would say the #1 concern is the Columbia River. The river is the lifeblood to our area. It's the reason that we're here. Without its water, we wouldn't be here because this is a desert. And it's sand, but people don't understand that sand with water it moves underground. And so having a landfill on the banks of the river that are down gradient, people are extremely concerned, especially when the EPA says that all landfills leak, what that will do to the river.
One of the things that Rubenko has done was when the state was doing its initial effort to draft the standards for siting hazardous waste facilities, which are obviously critical standards. Rubenko successfully lobbied to get itself exempted from the siting criteria. And given that this is probably, this potentially would be the major facility sited in Washington, it's just an outrage that they tried to do that, and second, that they succeeded.
We are at the point now to where we have gone to our legislatures, we've gone to the DOE hearings, we have played the game all along as it should be, and we are still being forced so far to take this material. We're not going to tolerate this type of thing. We have had it with the undue strain, stress, expense that has been burdened upon us. We're going to stop these individuals one way or the other. We have too much invested of our lives, our livelihood, to sacrifice this area for the cheap and convenient dumping of urban industrial waste.
This is in the confidential section, and it would make it available for research. There are a number of items of information in this confidential section.
And the large special interest groups have lobbyists in your state capital, and their lobbyists are being paid good money to try and get the state to make their clients richer. Those lobbyists are not being paid by the taxpayers to save the taxpayers money.
The Senate Bill 6252 was a dark horse bill. That was Senator Patterson's 3-year moratorium and study. It was never supposed to get out of the Senate, but it did.
What happened to stop its progress?
Well, in the Senate, the situation was that it was bottled up in the Rules Committee and that it would never pass out of the Rules Committee without the moratorium being removed.
In trying to get this bill through the state legislature, through the House committee, not only did the firm fight hard on it, saying that this was likely to jeopardize the Washington State Capacity Assurance Plan, but also the State Department of Ecology stepped in and said that they were fearful that it was going to upset the State Capacity Assurance Plan.
Most new hazardous waste incinerators are being proposed in response to a second EPA deadline that mandates states must have a plan to handle all hazardous waste generated within their borders by October 1989, or face the loss of federal Superfund cleanup money. Although EPA's ruling said nothing about mandatory incineration, many states planned commercial incinerators as the keystone of their waste plan.
And nobody will own up to being the source of it, but somehow EPA Region 10 got the idea to send a letter to both Nancy Rust in the State House Environmental Affairs Committee and to Senator Metcalf, whose committee was considering a moratorium, to say that they would be very likely to upset the State Capacity Assurance Plan if they were to go through with these bills that would slow down the process.
And why do you think that they sent this letter?
Well, it's rumored that those who opposed the bill, mainly the companies who are trying to site an incinerator, asked that it be sent, but I don't know that that's true. That's only a rumor.
And you've seen it again with this legislation. People said, well, here's this legislation that can save us, and they went out there and got
it goes through the Rules Committee, goes through all these places and goes through this process, and David Savy and ECO show up one day, and it's changed. It's now a worthless document.
And it's just so,
and that overrides the thousands and thousands of phone calls and the postcards.
I mean, the
that they get from us
politicians
normal people.
admitted that they got more letters and more phone calls on these pieces of legislation than anything else in this legislative session. Did it make any difference? No. Dave Saby showed up, talked to a couple politicians, and it was dead.
If you depend on fashionability of issues for major special interest groups to throw money at those issues, the society's in problem because no issue stays fashionable longer than a year. You have to ingrain into the structure of the society how to deal with issues. For example, the majority of waste materials developed and built and handled in this society are dumped in landfills or incinerated. That's what happens with our waste. Okay, that's part of society today. It will continue to be part of society until such time as the public says to the government, we don't want our waste materials dumped in landfills and incinerated. We want them recycled, and we want the tax money that we give you to be used instead of landfilling and incinerating to be used for recycling. And we want the companies that are getting rich because the materials are being dumped or burned to start to put some of that money into recycling. Till such time that that's put into the infrastructure of the society, hazardous and municipal waste will continue to be dumped into leaking landfills and will continue to be burned and not recycled.
And so to increase our use of less or non-hazardous products would encourage going back up the chain of production of less hazardous waste by manufacturers.
The county is realizing that the best thing to do about household toxics is not use them. There are many alternatives to the caustic and toxic cleaners we use. We should be turning these cupboards under our sinks, which are usually sources of many toxic little chemicals for cleaning our homes, turn them into places where we store things that can help us safely clean the house. Scrub brushes, pure soap, borax, baking soda. There are books that the state and the county produce to tell you what are safer alternatives.
It is only people that are going to be able to solve this problem. It is only people that are going to be able to solve it. They have to remember where this clenched fist symbol comes from. Not from the 60s, but from Chief Sitting Bull, speaking to his braves and saying, if we stand as fingers apart, we can be broken one by one. But if we come together, we form a powerful fist. We win victories when we come together in the thousands, in the millions, and we demand changes to protect our environment, to protect our lives, to stop wasting our energies. And that's the way we're going to win this battle. We must come together. And we have to start in our own communities, and each of us realize that each of us can make a difference. And we have to start making that difference, or, you know, this planet's gone.
It's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be fair. And I guess what I have to tell myself all the time is this is why I'm doing it. You need a combination of communication skills, friendship with the right people, financial resources, stick-to-itiveness, organizational skills, and a million other things. And on top of that, you need a whole lot of luck. So it's really not easy for the public to get involved. Kept going through the agencies, Northwest Air Pollution, the Department of Ecology, our local health department, the Environmental Protection Agency, and I just became a nuisance to them. And I guess after a while I was enough of a nuisance that they did something. The wheels of justice and bureaucracy move very slowly, but I packed up my kids a year and a half, almost 2 years ago, and we went down and camped out on the lawn of the governor. And then I was really a radical, right? I mean, I was real worried about my children. We sat in his office for almost 3 months, and we got an audience with him, and he promised to help. And I think that things have been moving, very slowly, but moving. In half the time, we had almost 12,000 names. The county council was so impressed that they just went ahead and adopted it without letting it go to the voters. And then what's happened since then is we've ended up in court in a lawsuit with Browning Ferris Industries, the company that's been bringing this in, and they got an injunction. So as long as it's in court, they're still bringing that stuff in. So it's like one step forward and I don't know how many steps back. We've been a story around the country, and I think we're giving people around the country some incentive on action, on what to do and on how to do it. And if we can even do that, I think that's real positive, no matter what happens here. But I think this case is going to end up in the Supreme Court, and I think we're going to win. If a community cannot determine what it will and will not tolerate when it comes to hazards, I think we're in big trouble in this country.